Most companies build their spending rules around a simple, unspoken assumption. Employees can't be fully trusted with the company's money, so every meaningful expense needs a manager's sign-off before it happens. Ritz-Carlton built its entire service model on the opposite assumption. Starting in the 1990s, the hotel chain gave every single employee, regardless of role, seniority, or tenure, the authority to spend up to $2,000 per guest, per incident, to solve a problem on the spot, with zero approval required from anyone. A housekeeper could replace a guest's damaged item without calling a supervisor. A front desk clerk could comp an entire stay to make a service failure right. Nobody had to escalate up a chain of approval while a frustrated guest stood there waiting for someone with enough authority to actually do something. This wasn't a minor perk buried in an employee handbook. It became one of the most studied examples in hospitality and management education of what real, structural trust looks like when a company commits to it fully, instead of talking about empowerment in a mission statement and then requiring 3 signatures to act on it. To understand why Ritz-Carlton built the policy this way, you have to understand the philosophy the whole company was built around. The brand's founding service philosophy, sometimes summarized in the phrase, "ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen," positioned frontline staff not as low-authority order takers, but as trained professionals capable of exercising real judgment, the same kind of trust you'd extend to a skilled tradesperson rather than a cashier following a script. This wasn't just aspirational language. It shaped concrete operational choices, most visibly the $2,000 empowerment policy, but also extensive, sustained training investment before any employee ever reached the point of being handed that authority. The empowerment policy didn't exist in isolation. It sat on top of a hiring and training system specifically designed to make that level of trust a reasonable bet rather than a reckless one, which turns out to be the detail most companies trying to copy the headline policy skip entirely. The business logic behind the $2,000 threshold was specific and, once you sit with it, genuinely counterintuitive to how most organizations think about cost control. A guest complaint resolved instantly by the actual person standing in front of the guest creates a measurably stronger outcome than the identical complaint escalated through 2 or 3 layers of approval and resolved 2 days later by email, even when the eventual resolution offered to the guest is exactly the same. Delay itself functions as a real cost, not a neutral administrative step, because a guest's frustration compounds the longer a fix takes, and because the emotional experience of being told, "Let me get you someone who can actually help," versus being helped immediately by the person you're already talking to are simply different experiences, regardless of what the final resolution looks like on paper. Most companies build approval chains as if delay were free. Ritz-Carlton built its policy around the explicit premise that delay is one of the most expensive things happening in a service failure, often more expensive than the dollar amount of the fix itself. Picture the 4 or 5 kinds of moments this policy was actually designed for, because they're mundane enough that it's easy to underestimate how often they occur across a large hotel operation. A guest suit gets damaged by a hotel dry cleaning mishap. Instead of filing a report that gets reviewed by a manager sometime later, the staff member handling it can authorize replacement or compensation immediately, while the guest is still standing there, visibly relieved rather than left to stew over an open ticket. A family's anniversary dinner reservation gets lost in a booking error. A restaurant host, without checking with anyone, can comp the meal or arrange an upgraded table on the spot, turning what could have become a 1-star review into a story the guest tells other people about how well the hotel handled its own mistake. A guest mentions offhand that a shipped package with important documents never arrived before an important meeting. A concierge, empowered to spend whatever it takes up to the threshold, can arrange expedited local printing, courier services, or replacement materials without waiting for anyone's blessing. And in the case that became something of a legend in service industry circles, a child's beloved stuffed animal gets left behind after checkout. Empowered staff can go well beyond a simple mail back, treating the recovery itself as an opportunity to create a genuinely memorable moment for the family, all funded and authorized entirely at the employee's own discretion. None of these moments individually justifies a strategic policy. What justifies it is that moments like these happen constantly, at scale, across hundreds of properties worldwide, every single day, and the cumulative effect of resolving nearly all of them instantly instead of through committee is what actually built Ritz-Carlton's reputation for service consistency. It's worth dwelling on what training investment actually meant in practice, because this is the part of the story that gets flattened whenever the $2,000 figure gets repeated as a standalone hack. Ritz-Carlton employees went through extensive onboarding built around the company's defined service values before they ever touched spending authority, and daily operational meetings across properties, sometimes called lineups, reinforced those standards continuously rather than treating training as a one-time orientation event completed in the first week and never revisited. Employees weren't simply told the dollar figure and left to interpret it however they wanted. They were steeped, repeatedly and structurally, in what kind of judgment call the company actually wanted them making, what solving the guest's problem meant in practice versus what it didn't, and where the line sat between generous service recovery and simply giving away the hotel's money for no operational reason. This is the unglamorous, expensive part of the model that rarely makes it into the retelling, because we invested heavily and continuously in training before extending trust is a much less viral sentence than employees get to spend $2,000 with no approval. But the second sentence only works because of the first one. The obvious objection any manager raises immediately on hearing this policy is abuse. Give every employee access to $2,000 per incident with no approval required, and surely some meaningful percentage of people will overspend, either through carelessness or dishonesty. In practice, Ritz-Carlton found this fear was substantially overblown. Most real guest problems cost far less than the ceiling to resolve properly, so the $2,000 figure functioned less as a number employees regularly approached and more as a signal, a way of telling staff, explicitly and structurally, that the company trusted their judgment enough to not need a bureaucratic leash for the vast majority of situations they'd actually encounter. And trusted employees, hired and trained specifically around a defined set of service values before ever being handed this authority, generally behave the way trusted employees tend to when an organization treats them like professionals rather than suspects. This mirrors a broader pattern researchers have documented across other industries too, that when companies invest heavily in hiring for values fit and training before extending high-trust authority, misuse rates tend to run lower than executives instinctively predict. Precisely because the trust wasn't handed out blindly, it was handed out after the company had already done the harder work of making sure it was a reasonable bet. There's a useful psychological framework for understanding why this kind of empowerment produces the results it does, developed by researcher Gretchen Spreitzer in the 1990s around what she called psychological empowerment in the workplace. Spreitzer's framework identifies 4 components that together determine whether an employee actually feels empowered, not just nominally granted authority on paper, meaning whether the work connects to something the employee genuinely values, competence, whether they believe they're actually capable of doing the task well, self-determination, whether they have real choice in how they act, and impact, whether they believe their actions genuinely influence outcomes that matter. A $2,000 spending authority checks the self-determination and impact boxes almost by definition, but it only becomes real, felt empowerment, the kind that changes how an employee actually shows up at work, when it's paired with the training that builds genuine competence and a service culture that gives the whole job meaning beyond just processing a transaction. Ritz-Carlton's policy worked as well as it did specifically because the company had already built the other 3 legs of that stool before adding the 4th. This kind of empowerment isn't unique to hospitality, and looking at where else it's shown up helps clarify what actually makes it work rather than what makes it a fluke of one industry. Netflix built much of its early reputation for operational speed around a similar principle in its expense and vacation policies, summarized in guidance amounting to act in Netflix's best interest, deliberately replacing detailed rulebooks with a much smaller set of general principles and heavy trust in employee judgment, a philosophy the company later documented publicly as its freedom and responsibility culture. The common thread between Netflix's approach and Ritz-Carlton's isn't the specific policy mechanics. An expense guideline and a per-guest dollar ceiling are pretty different tools. It's the underlying bet that the cost of occasionally trusting the wrong person is smaller than the cumulative cost of building elaborate approval infrastructure to catch that rare bad actor, applied against every single good-faith employee making a routine, reasonable decision. Companies that make this bet successfully tend to share the same prerequisite Ritz-Carlton relied on: real investment in hiring and reinforcing the judgment they're then trusting, rather than simply removing rules and hoping for the best. It's worth being honest, too, about how this policy fits within Ritz-Carlton's much larger operational identity, because the empowerment budget wasn't a standalone gimmick. It was one visible piece of a broader quality management system the company built around continuous training, defined service standards, known internally as the gold standards, and rigorous daily reinforcement of both. Ritz-Carlton became one of the few hospitality brands ever to win the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, a rigorous U.S. government-backed recognition for organizational excellence. And it won it twice, a rare feat, with the empowerment policy repeatedly cited by the company itself and by outside researchers studying the award as a central, structural reason for its consistency across hundreds of independently operated properties worldwide. Consistency at that scale is genuinely hard to achieve through top-down control alone, because no central office can realistically monitor every guest interaction happening simultaneously across the globe. Distributed trust, backed by distributed training, turns out to scale in a way centralized approval chains structurally cannot. There's research from outside hospitality worth naming here too, because the underlying cost of approval bottlenecks isn't specific to hotel guests. It shows up in ordinary corporate workflows just as reliably. Studies of decision latency inside large organizations, the kind consulting firms and organizational researchers have run for decades on internal process design, consistently find that the time cost of routing a decision through multiple approval layers frequently exceeds the actual monetary risk the approval step was meant to guard against, especially for low-dollar, low-risk decisions that get funneled through the same heavyweight process as genuinely high-stakes ones. Organizations rarely measure this cost directly, because it's diffuse. A few hours lost here, a frustrated customer there, spread across thousands of small decisions rather than concentrated in one visible line item, the way a single instance of employee fraud would be. That asymmetry in visibility is a big part of why so many companies keep unnecessary approval layers in place long after they stop making financial sense. The cost of the friction is invisible and distributed, while the cost of a single instance of misuse is vivid, easy to point to, and easy to build a new rule around after the fact. The common mistake managers make when they hear this story isn't disagreeing with the philosophy in the abstract. Almost everyone nods, along with empower your frontline employees as a general principle. The mistake happens in the design of the actual approval systems most companies run day to day, which get built around defending against the worst-case employee rather than serving the typical one. A manager sets up an expense approval process, or a customer service escalation policy, or a discount authorization rule by imagining the rare person who might abuse it, and then builds a system that makes every single employee, including the overwhelming majority who would never abuse it, wait through the same friction to guard against that minority. The result is a policy optimized to prevent a rare bad outcome at the cost of guaranteeing a common mediocre one: slow resolutions, frustrated customers, and employees who quietly learn that their judgment isn't trusted, which tends to make them stop exercising judgment altogether, even in situations where they'd clearly know the right call. Consider a scenario well outside hospitality to see how directly this same mistake transfers. A software company requires every customer support agent to get manager sign-off before issuing a refund above $50, a threshold set years earlier and never revisited. On its own, $50 sounds like a perfectly reasonable place to draw a line. In practice, the overwhelming majority of support tickets involve a refund request somewhere between $50 and $200, which means nearly every routine complaint now routes through a manager's queue, turning what should be a 2-minute resolution into a same-day or next-day wait, while the agent pings a manager who's in back-to-back meetings and doesn't see the request until the afternoon. The customer experiences exactly the delay as cost problem Ritz-Carlton built its entire policy around avoiding, and the company never even notices the damage because customer waited 4 extra hours for a routine refund doesn't show up as a line item anywhere. It just quietly shows up later as a slightly lower renewal rate, and a handful of frustrated reviews nobody traces back to the approval threshold that caused them. The actionable fix isn't trust everyone with everything, which would be its own kind of naive overcorrection. It's a specific audit any manager can run on their own team's approval structures. For each approval requirement currently in place, ask honestly whether it exists to prevent a catastrophic, hard-to-reverse error, the kind that genuinely justifies friction, or whether it exists mainly to prevent a small, easily correctable mistake that costs far less to occasionally allow than the cumulative delay costs across every single instance where it's required. A refund under a modest threshold, a small discretionary discount, a minor service recovery gesture, these rarely rise to the level of risk that justifies routing every instance through a manager's inbox. Set an explicit, well-communicated threshold, invest in the training that makes trusting people at that threshold a reasonable bet rather than a leap of faith, and then actually let people act inside it without second-guessing every decision after the fact. The dollar figure matters less than most people assume. What matters is building the same three-legged foundation Ritz-Carlton built first: careful hiring, real training, and a genuine service culture, before handing over the fourth leg, authority, and expecting it to hold weight on its own. There's a broader reflection worth sitting with here, because it cuts against how most organizations instinctively think about control. The instinct in most companies is that trust has to be earned incrementally, extended in small doses, expanded only after an employee has proven themselves over months or years of monitored performance. Ritz-Carlton's model inverts that sequence in a way that's genuinely uncomfortable for a lot of managers to sit with. It extends meaningful trust upfront, structurally, to every employee at every level, and treats the training and hiring process as the actual filter, rather than treating ongoing approval requirements as a permanent substitute for that filter. Once someone clears the bar to work there at all, the company stops asking them to keep reproving themselves through bureaucratic friction on every individual decision. That's a genuinely different philosophy of what an organization owes its own people, and it's worth asking, honestly, whether your own approval processes reflect trust you've already decided to extend by hiring someone, or whether they quietly reflect a trust you're still withholding indefinitely, one small approval request at a time, no matter how long someone's actually worked for you. If stories like this one change how you think about running a team, follow along. There's more where this came from.